What's up, guys? Mike back with another video. This is just going to be a little fun video. It's about a subject that I've, thought about on and off for a while now. And it's regarding the Friday the 13th fan film. Now, the Friday the 13th franchise is obviously something like dear to my heart and love it a bit. Love pretty much every entry in the series. And a lot of fan films as well, I love the Never Hike Alone and Never Hike in the Snow, and obviously the new one I haven't seen yet, 13, a Jason fan film, or whatever it's called, looks really impressive. But in terms of like what I'd like to see in a Friday the 13th fan film, it's something that I've neither the time nor the money nor the ability to direct, a fan film, let alone a major production. So I'd just like to put my idea out there. Maybe one day in the future, maybe someone will come across this video, although it's highly unlikely. I'll think, you know what, that's a good idea. I wouldn't mind trying that. Um, in terms of like, the reason I say a fan film is because would be far too meta to be a real Friday the 13th movie. It probably wouldn't fit into the whole Friday the 13th universe. But as a Friday the 13th fan film, I think it could really work. And so basically, my premise is Friday the 13th in this universe that I'm putting forward, it ends after part 7. So Jason ends up back at the bottom of Camp Crystal Lake in 1988, which is when I know there's a bit of a weird timeline thing where the New Blood isn't set in 1988 if you kind of do the maths. But forget that. Let's just go by the year it was made. So in 1988, Jason is put to the bottom of the lake, as in the events of New Blood. There is no Jason Takes Manhattan in this universe, because obviously in that universe he goes to Manhattan and he ends up in the storm drain or the sewage drain, whatever, in New York. So he doesn't end up in the lake at the end of the film. So that would kind of play into an issue with this film, which I'd be proposing. So basically, in this universe, the film ends after New Blood ends in 1988. Jason, obviously, stuck them up in the lake, and as time goes on, as the 80s comes into the 90s, Jason is forgotten about. Jason sort of ceases to exist in a way that, and this is where the meta aspect comes in, because the Friday the 13th franchise was such a part of the 1980s, and it's so intertwined with that decade. When the 90s hit, Jason basically ceased to be relevant, and it's almost that thing of like, almost like a Mandela effect, if you know what I mean, where people don't remember anything that happened during that time period at Camp Crystal Lake. So it's kind of like, it kind of, anything that happened during that decade at Camp Crystal Lake is kind of wiped people's minds once they hit that the 90s hit, because Jason is so intertwined with that decade. So as we come into the 90s, Jason is stuck at the bottom of Camp Crystal Lake, and because he's a product of the 80s, he ceases to have any sort of power. He's completely sort of helpless at the bottom. He's not aware of anything. He's not awake. He's not, sentient. He's just like a corpse at the bottom of the lake. Doesn't decompose. Still has that. Well, decomposes to a point, as he already has done, but not anymore. So he kind of retains his body. He doesn't just become bones. But because he's forgotten about, he loses any ability to sort of interact with the outside world. And this progresses basically throughout the 90s, into the 2000s, into the 2010s. By this point, Jason's just a distant memory. And so what I would propose is that at some point in the last couple of years, a bunch of teens hook up and make their way to Camp Crystal Lake, maybe either totally unaware of the legend of Camp Crystal Lake, or maybe somebody's just maybe the main character's got like an inkling. They can they can remember that something isn't quite right about Camp Crystal Lake, and they can't put the finger on it. But as they make their way there, the main character or one of the side characters, it doesn't really matter, has basically come up with an idea of an 80s weekend at Camp Crystal Lake where they all get in a car, head to Camp Crystal Lake, and basically spend the weekend or a couple of days longer, it doesn't really matter, at the lake, and totally do away with any modern gadgets. Make it old school. They all bring old Walkmans and bring old music from back in the day, 80s music, nothing after that. And the way this would work as well is because obviously you arrive for an 80s weekend, goodbye cell phones, mobile phones. So as everybody arrives at the lake, one of our characters takes the cell phones and locks them away in a strong box. They're the only person with the key, and they're the only person who can access those phones. So by this point, you've got a character who's the only person who can really contact the outside world, because these people have been left without any sort of technology. And this is quite a remote campsite. This obviously this would be New Jersey, rural New Jersey, where Novi Bosco is. And I've got it on good authority from people in the community that how remote it is, and you can't even get a cell phone signal half the time. But if you completely take away that element, it really makes for a more interesting film. And obviously by this point, the kids, setting up camp and all that, and start living the 80s lifestyle where they get the 80s clothes on, and they've got the Walkmans and they've got the ghetto blasters. And then so the first night, they have a big massive party and it's all old school and they're playing all these 80s tunes. Maybe even get a band in, you know what I mean? About like do like 80s style music. And it's just at this point that with all this 80s nostalgia going on, and with the music blaring out with all this cheesy 80s music, a lot of synth. I was actually thinking you could even bring in a lot of these new synthwave acts from the 2010s. Okay, it'd be cheating slightly, but if anybody, my fish is going insane in the background. That's quite distracting, I know. A lot of these synthwave artists from the 2010s take a lot of their inspiration from the 80s and 80s horror films, especially, acts like Gunship, Perturbator, The Midnight, Kallax, all these really great synthwave acts. I'd be down for using them in the soundtrack. Okay, they're technically not 80s music, but because they've got that 80s feel, I'd be totally down with them playing that sort of music. But so as the party progresses, the night goes on, people get more and more drunk and the music gets louder and louder, and people start to lose their inhibitions. That stirs something in Jason. In his head, he thinks the 80s are back. During the whole 90s, 2000s, 2010s, he can't he can't claw his way back into to being a sentient being, because he's been forgotten about, and he's a product of the 80s. So as this is all going on, the music's getting louder and the whole 80s nostalgia, it starts to seep into the lake, if you know what I mean, like in a sort of invisible way, and it kind of makes its way down into the lake where Jason's obviously held captive. I think how was he at the end of part 7? Was he trapped under some rocks? I can't remember. I need to watch that film again. But anyway, all this nostalgia, all this 80s nostalgia, eventually something happens, boom, Jason fully awake now, and you could then use something, whether it's a lightning strike or whatever, it's been used before in Noble, who cares, and that would be the beginning of the awakening of Jason. And obviously at this point, he becomes fully aware, he thinks it's the 80s again, and he just goes on a killing spree. And obviously the first person to be killed will be the person who's got the key to the strongbox with all the cell phones. So then you've got this cat and mouse game now with 5, 6 teens, however what you want it to be, being stalked by Jason. And this would happen on the first night, but obviously it would probably would set it over more than one night. You know, keep it going over a couple of days, and he slowly picks them off one by one. And for the first few kills, the other group aren't, the rest of the group aren't aware of what's going on. Yeah, and obviously, I'd really obviously want it to be authentic. Camp Nobi Bosco. That would be the icing on the cake. But obviously, restrictions, that would probably be an issue. I mean, I'm talking about this like this. They're going to make this film. This is my dream fan film. This would be my dream Friday film, arguably, because it's just, I think it's a really, really good idea, and this is all my idea. I haven't ripped it off somebody else. This is just something I came up with. But yeah, that's just so, maybe one day in the future somebody might see this video and think that's a damn fine idea. But until then, we can always dream and just hope that Victor Miller and his name escapes me. Sean Cunningham. Let's hope they can resolve the differences and get back to, making Friday the 13th films. Until then, we can hope a dream. Anyway, that was just my pitch for a Friday the 13th fan film. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.